Morning, Pinchas Budik. It's my son David. We're just visiting from Beit Shemesh in Israel. I grew up in Knoxville actually, and my parents moved to Brentwood about a decade ago. So we're in town for a few weeks, and Rabbi Saul has always given us a very warm welcome. So I'd love to be back, and love to see the growing community here. So looking forward to the course of this.
The first thing you need to know when you're studying a philosophical book is what the question is. Rambam, as I mentioned last time, does not announce that in the Guide to the Perplexed. He thinks, as the rabbis of the Talmud anticipated in Chagiga, that if you know what the problems are, you'll have been worrying about them for a long time, and you don't need to have them called out for you. And if you have not been worrying about those problems, then this is not really the book for you. You take everything at face value, and that's fine, and you can go along as you were without any difficulty. And he doesn't want to present difficulties for those who are not prepared to deal with them. I mentioned last time that his idea of preparation sounds like a really excellent high school education or a really excellent college education. He expects you to know some mathematics, and you've got to remember that in his time, algebra was invented in the Middle East. It was a period of great ferment. Philosophically, it was a period of great development in astronomy, and Rambam was a contributor to the astronomy of his day. He was at the forefront of the understanding of that astronomy. It was a period when you needed to know mathematics well, you needed to know logic well. He found that a lot of people who tried to do theological studies didn't have the background that they needed in mathematics or logic. And some of the Muslim theologians got themselves in a lot of, they tied themselves up in knots because they were trying to invent logic on their own, and the logic that they did was very ad hoc. It was designed to sort of yield the conclusions that they wanted to yield. You start out with the conclusion and you work your way up to it, and then of course what you've used to work your way up to making that conclusion gets you in trouble in other ways. It makes it incoherent with your experience, your knowledge of nature, and so forth. They twisted everything in a way that didn't succeed in a logical, valid fashion to reaching the conclusion that they wanted to reach, and also implied all kinds of absurdities. And there are two kinds of absurdities if you think about it. There are logical absurdities where you contradict yourself, and then there are natural absurdities where you contradict what you know. For example, the solidity of this table, or the facts of the way living beings reproduce, or the way it happens that when you take a piece of fabric and put it into a vat full of dye, and why does that happen? Those Muslim theologians, and have had their imitators among Jews as well, thought that God causes everything. They were at odds with the very idea of nature, and they accomplished a couple of things which were quite different from what they expected. They think that God causes everything, so they did away with nature and didn't have any what we call horizontal causality. One natural event wasn't able to cause another because God was directly involved in doing everything. It was God that made the fabric turn blue, and if God felt like it, he could make it do something else completely arbitrarily or just disappear. Those people were at odds with nature, and Rambam believed, as a practicing physician, as a man who studied astronomy, as a man who very much loved the understanding of nature, they had vitiated the very idea of creation itself. Think about it. if God is responsible for bringing out every single event, then God's creation was creating things that had no character of their own. They didn't have any causal dispositions. They didn't cause anything to happen. It wasn't the flame that made the cooking happen, right? It was God that made it happen, and the flame was just some kind of idle accessory. That kind of theology was thoughtless, and the logic that was devised to make it work was also thoughtless. They hadn't thought things through. And Rambam really wants you to be prepared in the way that he himself had been prepared and the way that educated people in his time were prepared. You don't start studying theology before you know a little bit about nature and before you know a little bit about logic. And you need to know some mathematics too. Geometry, for example. If you're very naive in geometry, you'd take a square that was 3 by 3 and you'd think, okay, it's 3 on the side, and it's 3 on the bottom, and it's 3 on the top. Diagonal looks like it's 3 also. That was crude. It was foolish. And you could prove, if you knew a little geometry, that diagonal cannot be equal to the side. The diagonal has to be, in fact, an irrational number. The world can't be made out of indivisible atoms the way those theologians that he had first studied when he was trying to understand about theology, it couldn't be the way they thought. It was absurd, even logically. It was mathematically demonstrable that logic, that theology didn't work. What kind of problems is the Rambam going to address in the guide? He names them by code names that they were given in the Talmud, again in Chagiga, which is warning people not to get in over their heads, as the Rambam put it. The two subjects that the Talmud warns people not to teach, unless those who are seeking to learn are really well prepared to learn and have that kind of background as he understands it, are called Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah. I talked a little about that last time. Maaseh Bereshit means the account of creation. Those who are naive, those who are very accepting, those who aren't really thinking about things, oh yeah, well it says in Bereshit that in the beginning God created heaven and earth. They take it at face value, and it's some kind of an abracadabra act by which God says, Yehi, or let there be light, and lo and behold, light appears. How does that happen? If God is transcendent, if God is infinite, if God is absolute, it's all very well to use that implied metaphor of suggesting that God is a king who has only to command, and lo and behold, it happens. That's very nice, but it doesn't tell you how that happens, and it doesn't address the problem that was raised by philosophers from the beginning of Greek philosophy, and particularly on to Aristotle and the followers of Aristotle in Rambam's time. They thought the idea of getting something from nothing was absurd. They thought it was unscientific. They thought it was illogical. How are you going to deal if you are perplexed about a problem with that, like that? How are you going to deal with the objections that will be raised and the questions that will arise about how such a thing could happen? So Maaseh Bereshit refers in the first instance to the act of creation, the account of the act of creation as given in the Torah. But it goes further if you think about it, because if God is implied poetically to be a king, God is apparently in charge. How does God rule a world where God is non-physical and the world is physical, where God is infinite and everything in the world is finite and determinate and has a definite nature? How does God, as the Kabbalists later put it, scale himself down? How do you get that Tzimtzum happening where God adjusts his requirements and his expectations to the capabilities of matter, which has nothing in common with God, to the capabilities of finite things, which are determinate? Big question there. So it's not just a question of how did God create, it's also a question of how does God govern? How does God judge? How does God interact with the world? That's part of the basis of raising the question about Maaseh Bereshit. What about Maaseh Merkavah? The reference, as I mentioned last time, is to the vision of Ezekiel. Ezekiel had a vision when he was in exile on the banks of the Babylonian river Kebar, that he saw this remarkable being mounted on a chariot, sometimes called God's throne, and he seems to be saying that he saw God. That's very contradictory to the biblical idea that you can't really see God. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses is told, you can't see my face. And if you translate that a little bit, it turns out to mean you can't know God directly and fully and comprehensively in terms of what God is. God's ipseity, God's perfect being, is beyond our finite understanding. How then did God manifest himself? Problematic enough in the case of Ezekiel. But how does God manifest himself at all? How does Moshe Rabbeinu know how to put into words what God requires and expects of any of us, human beings in general or Israelites in particular? The problem of revelation has to do with a disproportion between God's infinite perfection and transcendence and non-physicality and our immediate experience and limited knowledge and our knowledge is all dependent on our senses. And God doesn't use senses because God isn't physical. How do you deal with that kind of discrepancy? So the story about Maaseh Merkavah, referring to the extreme case of Ezekiel's vision, which takes a very physical form, how do you explain the discrepancy between that and the kind of legislative, prophetic, revelatory experience, the kind of experience that a mystic might have in meditating, or the kind of experience that even a mathematician might have when the mathematician says, "Aha, I've got it. I see how to solve that problem." How do we latch on to something which is beyond the realm of our sensory, empirical experience? Rambam identifies those two subject areas, Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah, with two areas of philosophy that were dealt with by Aristotelian philosophers in his own time. Maaseh Bereshit he identifies with physics. Now you have to understand, physics in those terms was much broader than the physics you might study in high school, where you learn Newtonian and post-Newtonian physics. Physics meant anything, dealt with anything in the material world. The Greek word physics, physica, has a counterpart in Latin, which is natura. And physics was the study of nature at large, whether it has to do with objects in motion or at rest or interacting with each other, but it also included what we would now call chemistry. It also included what we would now call biology. It included every one of the natural sciences. They were all together under the subject of physics. As for Maaseh Merkavah, Rambam identifies that with metaphysics. Metaphysics is a term that one often hears. Sometimes you go into a bookstore and you see a section of the bookstore which is called occult, and sometimes people think of metaphysics has to do whatever's not natural. That's not how Aristotelian philosophers like the Rambam understood it. Metaphysics, as Aristotle first defined it, by the way, Aristotle never used that term. It was a term originally introduced by people who edited Aristotle's works. It was the part of his philosophy that came after the physics, metaphysica, all right? But it came after the physics because it was more general. Suppose, for example, if you want to ask the question, is everything physical? Is it the case that there's anything that is not physical? That's a metaphysical question. It's a question which physics itself can't answer because it doesn't know how to go beyond itself or whether it's possible to go beyond physics. Is there anything in the world? What does it mean for something to exist? That's a difficult area to get into. Think of physics as the study of nature, and think of metaphysics as examining the question of what, if anything, there is besides nature. That would include God, that would include spirits. The one area of metaphysics that's alive in philosophy today, philosophers for almost 100 years have been very dismissive of metaphysics. But there's one area of metaphysics that's alive today, and that is the question, it's sometimes called the very hard question, of how does the mind, which is not describable in physical terms, relate to the body, which is described in physical terms. The mind might be happy or sad, might be knowing or ignorant. All the adjectives, all the predicates that we assign to the mind don't apply in the physical world. In the physical world, we talk about the measure of things and the weight of things and the size and intensity. And when we get into particle physics, we can talk about qualities like strangeness and spin. But they're all things that have some kind of measure or some attempt to measure them or some relate them to other physical things, some observable characteristics, some experimental characteristics. The mind and its relation to the body is today regarded by philosophers as the very hard question, because the terms in which we describe the mind are not the same terms in which we would describe the object of the senses. Metaphysics is the general category of which the relationship of the infinite God to the determinate sensory world is going to have to be dealt with. How do we understand? And you notice the overlap between physics and metaphysics in Rambam's terms, because the question of how God rules the world is really a special case of the question of how does the non-physical relate to the physical, right? It's a metaphysical question itself. So in addition to broadening out one's knowledge of physics by saying it includes all the natural sciences as dealt with in the Aristotelian tradition, we're going to have to consider a narrowing of the realm of physics to the questions that really concern that person who is scratching his head and wondering, how am I to understand the Torah if I have exposure to scientific knowledge, if I've been trained in logic, if I think about astronomy and so forth, the geometry? How am I going to relate those things to one another? How am I going to understand the physics that Rambam is interested in the guide is not so much the description of the physical world. The physics that he's interested in the guide is today called cosmology. How did the world come about? Has it existed forever? Does it change? Will it be destroyed? Will it last? How do we know about such things? That's the area where physics expands into the discussions of cosmology. I've had the privilege once or twice in my years as a philosopher to talk with cosmologists. There aren't very many of them, but I've known a few. And one of the things I find is that when a philosopher talks to a cosmologist, a serious cosmologist, those inquirers get very speculative, they get very metaphysical, they get very theological. I've never met a cosmologist, a practicing astrophysicist today, who does not, within a few minutes, start talking to you about whether the world is infinite, how we can understand the notion of God, how we can understand the relationship of the physical to what might be non-physical. Cosmology, as the Rambam considers it, is very much a part of that larger discipline. Belongs to and belongs with metaphysics. Let me mention a couple of areas. I mentioned prophecy already as a part of Merkavah. Maseh Merkavah deals with the question of how God can relate to us intellectually, how can we know God. But think of a couple of other issues that the Rambam's going to deal with under Maseh Merkavah. You'll see this especially in part 3, because part 3 of the guide opens with his attempt to make sense of that strange and challenging vision that Ezekiel had. First 7 chapters of part 3. You're not there yet, but be prepared for it. Generalize on that question of how did Ezekiel envision that which is beyond nature. There's also the question of how did any prophet, Moshe Rabbeinu or any other prophet, relate to? How did he have any knowledge? But Moshe Rabbeinu in particular, because he's able to translate his vision of God into a system of laws and a way of life. That's what the Torah is. The Torah is a revealed book. How is it to be understood that God, who is infinite, can scale down his expectations to our human capabilities? Think about that line in Vayikra, right at the beginning of Vayikra. Kedoshim tehiyu, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord thy God, am holy. As I understand it, when God says that he's holy, he means that he's transcendent. And when we say in our prayers, repeating the visions of Ezekiel and Isaiah, God is holy, 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 it's like transcendent to the third power. If God is that far above us, how can we know God? How can we have any idea of what God expects of us? And similarly, if God is that far above us, how does God know anything about us? That's also part of the question of Maseh Merkavah, isn't it? How would God know individuals? And again, you have a challenge from Aristotelian philosophy, which would say, well, God isn't really about us. God is about the universe. God doesn't care about each individual. Rambam quotes from a great Aristotelian philosopher that he knew in Arabic translation, who has a wonderful name, Alexander of Aphrodisias. Aphrodisias was a place in North Africa. And Alexander of Aphrodisias was very exercised by the Stoics, who thought that there was providence over all things. In fact, the Stoics invented the concept of providence. They thought that the divine must be caring, and if the divine is caring, the God would look after us, tell us what he expects of us, and so forth, right? Alexander of Aphrodisias, as a good Aristotelian, thought that the Stoics were very wrong, and he thought, as the Rambam paraphrases his ideas, why would God care about us any more than a householder would care about his house cats? He doesn't try to manage his house cats. Rambam's example based on Alexander of Aphrodisias. And many of the philosophers Muslim philosophers in the school of Aristotle that Rambam had to deal with, and that the perplexed person that he's writing for would have to think about and be perplexed by. They believed that God was above knowing or caring about us. They thought that that was incompatible with the idea of divine transcendence. God transcends such mundane concerns. And yet, we believe that God has a covenant with us as a people, as individuals, and even with humanity at large. If you think about the covenant with Noah, where all humanity is descended from Noah, and God makes a covenant with Noah that he's not going to destroy the world again, and he's going to look after things, and the seasons will go in an orderly way. There God is seen as responsible for nature, not at odds with nature, not something that's uninterested in nature. How are we to understand notions of divine knowledge, notions of divine providence, notion of divine caring? Those are challenges that the perplexed person for whom the Rambam is writing would be finding very perplexing. Philosophy, represented by those great figures in the Aristotelian tradition, seems to be saying that God doesn't know. God knows universals, maybe. God knows all kinds of stuff about higher mathematics, but God doesn't know you and me. We've got a problem there. And that's the kind of problem that the Rambam wants to address. There's a prior problem, and that those of you who are reading into the guide will recognize it. The problem of how to talk about God at all. And that's what I want to focus on to a great extent today. I've also had interesting and important questions about that fascinating chapter 2 of the guide, so I want to come back to that. But I want to talk about first, how does the Rambam address the question of how does one succeed in talking about God, and particularly pointedly, how does the Torah get away with talking about God? If the Torah is talking about this absolutely transcendent God, why does it say that God had angry, or God was coming, walking around in the Garden of Eden? Why does it say all these things about God, all these anthropomorphic terms applied to God, where God has a face, where God sees and hears? What are we going to do with that? Now, I mentioned last time that some people who read the guide think that there are contradictions in it, and that the contradictions are meant to be hints of the fact that the Rambam doesn't really believe in what he's saying in the guide. I think that that's a mistaken view, and I refuted it at length in the little paperback, The Guide to the Guide. I think that the contradictions the Rambam is mainly concerned with is apparent contradictions in the Torah itself. And the biggest contradiction, I hinted at this last time, the biggest contradiction is between the idea that God is transcendent and can't be seen and can't be reduced to human terms, and the Torah's going about its way very systematically to tell you all kinds of things about God, what God said, what God wanted, what God commanded. How does the Torah do that? You get a hint of that, and it's a very indirect hint, which you won't recognize on first reading. When God mentions the various prerequisites to the kind of study that he thinks you're going to be getting into when you engage with Maaseh Merkavah and Maaseh Bereshit, he says you need to know mathematics and logic and astronomy. When he praises the student for whom he's writing and sending these chapters bit by bit from Cairo to Aleppo. But all those descriptions of that student are also hints, as I mentioned last time, they're pre-qualifications of the reader. You're ready to engage in this subject if you have a little logic, and you've gone into philosophy a little bit, and you know a little astronomy, etc. And if you haven't, you're not really the person for whom I'm writing. But he also praises that person in terms of prerequisites, even more obliquely, as somebody who had a poetic bent. He says that he was impressed by the younger man's maqamat. Maqamats are a genre in Arabic invented by a brilliant Arabic writer named Hamadani, who was a wizard with words. And one of the things that Hamadani did was he invented a genre, which not every poet can do. And the genre that he invented was a kind of hybrid of poetry and prose. They were short stories, typically three pages long. Very witty, very brilliant use of language, but they all had poetry intermixed with the prose. It's kind of like if you think about the way musicals used to be. If you've been to a Broadway musical or seen one on the tube or in the movies, where there's a story going along and it's partly a drama and it's partly the characters break into song all of a sudden, every now and then. Why is it important to the Rambam to describe, to admire the maqamat of this young man that he's writing for? Because that shows that the man has a poetic bent. And you need a poetic bent if you're going to understand the Torah. Because the contradiction between saying God is so transcendent that we can't say anything about him, and yet finding God described and explained in various ways in the Torah, that contradiction is resolved if you understand that the language of the Torah is systematically poetic. It uses metaphor, it uses irony, it uses all kinds of poetic devices to say what can't be ordinarily said in ordinary language. There's a wonderful remark in the Torah, and the Rambam quotes it in the Talmud, and the Rambam quotes it several times. Dibrat Torah kelashon bnei Adam. The Torah speaks in human language. Well, yeah, what else would it speak in if it's trying to communicate with us? It would have to speak in human language. What does it mean when the sages of the Talmud say that...
Dr. Goodman, just to make sure I understand right, so for us to understand when is poetic and when is literal, we need chazal. Otherwise we step into the minefield like the Christians do.
And the Rambam likes to point out, chazal is the sages of blessed memory. Chachamim zichronam lebracha. Yes, but Rambam says an interesting thing about chazal. Those sages of the Talmud entered right into the spirit of the metaphorical language of the Torah. They participated in it. He says that proves that they were not naive. They didn't take it literally. They could play that game because they knew how. For example, his example. I told you at the beginning that there's an implied metaphor when God says, Yehi or, let there be light, and light appears. What kind of being is it that can cause things to happen just by making a command? The implied metaphor is that God is a king. Well, God is like a king. God doesn't wear a crown. God doesn't wear royal robes. There's a question about whether God sits on a throne. Rambam doesn't think you can take that literally either. But he notices that the Chazal, the sages of blessed memory, enter into the same spirit of talking poetically because they always describe God as a king. They say it's an analogy, kivachol, as it were God is a king and he has his messengers and he sends them out to do things, and this is how they accomplish things. Let me go on and we'll have discussion after the first hour. What is the poetry of the Torah trying to accomplish, and what limitations does that impose upon us in understanding the Torah? It means that much of what we read in the Torah is metaphorical. Much of what we read in the Torah is not meant to be taken literally. It's okay if you take it literally, if that's the level you're at, but there are deeper meanings behind it. When it says that God walked, when it says that God has feet, ears, eyes, it's always getting at something else and using that anthropomorphic language to suggest something that the anthropomorphic language itself can only suggest and can't actually capture. Let me mention a few examples that he gives, and this is what you're reading if you're reading the first few dozen chapters of the guide. He mentions, for example, that there are certain terms which are applied, physical terms which are applied to God, and certain physical terms which are not. For example, one of his first examples is the word tavnit. Tavnit is cognate with the Hebrew word libnoah, to build. It means a construction, a building, a construct. That word is never applied to God in the Torah. But tmunah, which is also a physical thing, is applied to God. Tmunah means a picture. How can it be that God has an image which can be seen by Moses, metaphorically seen by Moses, but God doesn't have a physical form like a house or a building? Word like tmunah has to have more than one sense. And the special sense which applies to God is conceptual rather than physical. If you get the idea, you have an idea which is not necessarily constructed in the imagination, but more of a concept. You might have a concept of something in mathematics and geometry. You have a concept of gravity. Gravity is not something we can see. It's not something we can draw a picture of, but it's something we can represent in our mind. Similarly, when it says that God saw or beheld something, what does that mean? Well, on a literal level, it means, like, I see you, you see me. But there's also a passage in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes, which says, my heart has seen much wisdom. Wisdom is not the kind of thing you see with your eyes. There again, it's pushing you in the direction of something conceptual. It's telling you that the word to see might apply to visual perception, or it might apply to intellectual conception, which is something quite different. So when it says, for example, in Bereshit, God created various things and saw this and that and the other thing, and saw that it was good. To see the goodness of a thing is not the same as seeing the shape and color of a thing. That, again, is a conceptual meaning of the term. Similarly with the word makom, which is applied to God. Makom means literally a standpoint. It's the ordinary word in Hebrew for a place. And sometimes the rabbis, Chazal, used to like to call God Hamakom. And they would say, it's not that God has a place, it's that God is the place. Right? God is the place in which everything else exists. God is the ultimate reality. Makom there means status. As it says, he gives proof text for all these things. He filled the place of his fathers. That doesn't mean he slept in the same bed or walked in the same path. It means that he attained the same rank. What kind of rank? In this case, not a social rank. It could be a moral rank. It could be a status which involves a kind of stature of a spiritual nature. You start to see a differentiation of the senses of the terms, and you can organize them according to the lower sense, which is the more physical, and the higher sense, which is more social, and the higher sense, which is moral, and a still higher sense, which is spiritual. Now I'm going to tell you something that you won't have heard before. As you go through those early chapters of the guide, which are often called the lexicon, where Rambam walks you through the various anthropomorphic terms that are applied to God. I mentioned last time that there are people who think that the function of that lexicon is to refute anthropomorphism. And you'll probably recall, if you were here last time, that I said that no philosopher would take that claim seriously. Why not? Because there's no argument against anthropomorphism in those chapters. He doesn't prove that anthropomorphism is mistaken. He assumes it. He relies on the precedent set by the great Aramaic translator, Onkelos. And Onkelos is allergic to anthropomorphism, and he substitutes non-anthropomorphic terms for anthropomorphic terms. That's very good. But he's doing a translation, of course. He doesn't stop and explain why. So he's not actually telling you the right meaning of the term or how it works or resolving the ambiguity. Rambam wants you to see the ambiguity and to see how to get past it. But at this stage of the guide, he has not yet presented an argument against anthropomorphism. He will present an argument against anthropomorphism, and I'm going to anticipate by telling you what the argument will be, because the argument is kind of shocking, and it's a good example of the fact that he doesn't pull his punches. Rambam is very, very clear about what his position is, and he doesn't pretend to hold any position that he doesn't hold. What the argument will be in the end is that God does not have any attributes. You've probably learned in Cheder or elsewhere that God revealed his attributes to Moses on Mount Sinai, and they were Erech Apayim Rav Chesed Be'emet. We say them over and over again, especially on Yom Kippur. Why does Rambam feel compelled to say that God does not have any attributes? There are two reasons. One is that the word attribute also means predicate. It means predicate, something that can be said of something. One of the characteristics of philosophy in this period, and my colleague from the philosophy department will be a little surprised by this, we're always taught to distinguish what it is to talk about a thing and what the thing itself is. But Rambam calls the act of creation the same words as he calls the account of creation. They both present the same problem. And similarly here, the word he uses for attribute also means predicate. And from those two senses of that word, the word in Arabic is sifa, S-I-F-A. From those two senses of the word, you can see two arguments that he's going to use against the notion that God has any attributes or that God has any predicates. The one about not having attributes comes from the polemics that originally were engaged in by Muslims trying to defend their strict monotheism against Christian Trinitarianism. Christian missionaries would say to a Muslim, "Do you believe that God is wise?" And a Muslim would, of course, say yes. And then they would say, "But if God is wise, he must have wisdom." Of course. And if God has wisdom, the Christian would say, That's just what we mean by the Logos. That's what we mean by Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is God's wisdom. And the Muslim would be trapped by that rather sophisticated Christian missionary. And so the Muslims, to preserve their monotheism and keep it strict and straight, made a point of saying, God is wise, but not by way of wisdom. Wisdom is not a thing that God has. They didn't reify divine wisdom, lest they fall into the trap of assuming that God's wisdom was another thing side by side, another person of the Trinity, another reality side by side with God. And Rambam preserves that strict monotheism that his Muslim predecessors had for the same reason. But there's another reason, which I think you can already cotton on to, why he doesn't like the notion that any predicate properly applies to God. Why is that? Because God is transcendent, and all the predicates that we would use come to us from human language, which is the only kind of language we can speak, after all. Wouldn't mean much to us if God spoke to us in some non-human language, right? But the predicates would bring down divine transcendence. It would make God onto a human level. And the Rambam believes that the Torah takes advantage of the fact that human language operates on multiple levels, in multiple senses, going from the physical to the social, to the moral, to the spiritual, to point us in the right direction. If you understand that, you will not be shocked that the argument against anthropomorphism takes the form of a much more radical claim that all human language fails to reach God, and therefore that those who are entrusted with prophecy, those who experience revelation and have the gift of conveying what they have understood about God, as prophets do, the gift and the responsibility, relies on the ambiguity of language to use all the language that applies to God in a poetic way, pointing you in the right direction. So if you go through the numerous, it goes on for about 70 chapters, the numerous chapters of the guide which differentiate the different senses of the terms that are applied to God, which are anthropomorphic, you'll see that when Rambam gets around to providing the argument against anthropomorphism, he has not left you up the creek without a paddle. What do I mean by that? The great charge that's again made against negative theology, which is the negative theology is the idea that we can't pin down God, we can't describe God, God is totally above us. The great argument that's made against it, and it's made against it in every period, including our own. The great argument against negative theology is that it's like peeling an onion. You get down to the bottom and there's nothing there. There's no core, there's no center, there's no pit. Nothing solid. What do those chapters which assume that that anthropomorphic language is inapplicable to God, what do those arguments, what do those chapters give you instead? They give you the idea of an orientation from the physical, through the moral, to the spiritual and intellectual, which show you the way, which show the direction in which you can conceive of divine transcendence. The function of that poetry in the Torah is partly to deconstruct itself. The metaphors that are used about God undercut and undermine one another. They point you in the direction of divine transcendence by showing you the inadequacy of any poetic language to be applied to God, and at the same time they show you the direction in which that transcendence lies. Away from the physical, toward the spiritual and intellectual. And I've got to tell you, to the Rambam, spiritual or intellectual mean the same thing. Okay? So when he said in chapter 1 that the image of God is the human rational intellect, you can resolve that metaphor. Of course, God doesn't have a physical image, but you can resolve that image of an image. You can resolve that metaphor in terms of what is the essential form, what is the undeniable character of a human being. And that's rationality. And that points you in the right direction. It's not that God, as the Greeks thought, looks like a human being. It's that God has a mind which is not really the same as a human mind, but more in the direction of that than in the direction of a human body. So when you are, I'll repeat what I said before, when you see the argument for negative theology and against the idea that any of the predicates which are anthropomorphic are applicable to God, you're not left up the creek without a paddle. The paddle that you are given is the paddle of recognizing less physical, more spiritual, less bodily, more intellectual. It's more like the intellectual. That's the right direction in which divine perfection, which motivates the idea of transcendence, that's the direction in which divine perfection lies. Okay? So he hasn't left you with that empty onion. He's left you with an arrow. He's left you with an idea that points the way toward God. That gives you an idea of how to read those lexicographical chapters, and I think that the lexicographical chapters are a good example of what the Rambam does to shake off the casual reader. The casual reader will get bored. The casual reader won't notice the subtext. What's the subtext? The subtext is that division of the different senses of these terms, which start out physical and move towards the spiritual. Less and less physical, more and more social, moral, spiritual, intellectual. There's a passage from Bereshit that the Rambam quotes just as an example of how the imagery of the Torah can be very fraught with meaning. The passage is the passage about Jacob's ladder. Jacob has a dream. And in the dream, he sees angels going up and down a ladder. And there's lots of midrash about it. There are midrashim about how many angels there were and why there were four and why two were going up and two were going down. There's much midrash about it. And the Rambam makes a midrash upon that midrash. A midrash is a homily. Rambam makes a midrash upon that midrash. And what he does with it is he relates it to two very famous philosophical images which he treats in the same terms. And those images will be familiar to you if you've ever read any Plato. One comes from the Republic of Plato, which is the dialogue. If you've read a little of the Republic, you might have read that. And the other comes from the Symposium. The Symposium is a dialogue about love. The setting is a drinking party, which is what Symposium originally meant, a party where people get together to drink. Only in this particular party, Socrates and other companions of Socrates are discussing the nature of love, and they all have a different theory about the nature of love. And Socrates says, when he speaks last, that he learned the nature of love from a woman who was a prophet. Her name is Diotima of Mantinea. And she talks about a ladder of love. And the ladder of love has various stages and degrees. It starts out physical, and it gets more and more personal, more and more intellectual, until it turns into a pure love of understanding. The ladder of love is one of the most famous images in Plato. And when Rambam wants to understand the sequence of the senses in terms of which one can relate to the various anthropomorphic terms that are applied to God, because those are the only kind of terms that we've got, he fuses the idea of Jacob's ladder with the idea from the symposium of the ladder of love. So the ladder of Jacob's dream is anchored on the ground. And if you've been thinking about the physical as the basis, right, and moving on up to the moral and the spiritual and intellectual, then you understand that Plato was saying much the same thing as Jacob saw, that there was a progression from the lower to the higher. You're not going to do away with the physical. You're not going to deny the body or the body's presence in the physical world, but you're going to realize that that's not all there is, and that the body is the vehicle that leads us, allows us to move beyond our physicality and towards a higher understanding, a higher love, a higher reality. The other image from Plato, I think everybody gets to read the myth of the cave in Plato, where people are living in a cave and they think that these shadows on the wall are real realities because that's all they've ever seen, and of course the person who tells them that that's not so, if he's not careful about the way he puts it and the way he says it, he's going to get in trouble. They're going to wind up killing him. Plato wasn't exaggerating there, because he was referring to the fate of Socrates, who was killed for trying to tell the people the truth. But in the Republic, there's another image which is in a way more surprising than even the image of the cave, the point of which is that we're not living in the world of reality, we're living in a world of shadows. Even more surprising than that image is Plato's image of the divided line. And the divided line, in my opinion, is the first chart that was ever made. And it charts the levels of reality against the kinds of awareness that we have of them. Starting out with sensory things, moving on up to objects about which we have opinions, which might be true or false, moving further into the realm of mathematics, where we might have an awareness of pure mathematical relationships which are not physical, but of which we can have knowledge, not just opinion, and all the way up to the knowledge of the essences of things, which for the Rambam, in the human case, the essence of man, would be your soul and my soul, the rational intellect. Knowing things in terms of what Plato calls the forms, the pure ideas that give things their reality, that's real knowledge. That's the highest form of knowledge. And God is above the line. The line is a chart. It charts the kinds of knowledge against the kinds of objects of knowledge, starting with sensations, on up to bodies, on up to mathematical notions, on up to pure forms. And God above all of that in Plato's line. Okay? You can imagine how impressed Rambam was when he read Plato's Republic in Arabic translation, because it also says of Jacob's dream, right? the ladder was anchored on the ground and God was above it, God wasn't on it, and the angels were going up and down. And Rambam believes that the angels going up and down. Why were the angels going up? Well, the angels, he says, were like prophets. They were going up to get revelation and inspiration. Why were they going down? Because they had to go down to share what they had learned and guide and lead and help others to that same kind of knowledge. They have a knowledge of the transcendent world of pure intellectual, spiritual realities, which others who haven't climbed the ladder don't know and have to be guided and taught and led. You can begin to see how Moshe Rabbeinu could transform his inspiration into laws, into imagery, how any prophet could speak about God as a king, not so much relying on the metaphor, but using it to guide people. That's the structure of the lexicon, pointing you into the right direction to understand the imagery, which is the basis of prophecy in general, Mosaic prophecy, which is legislative in particular, because the legislation of Moshe Rabbeinu is not just a bunch of rules, but a system of law, coherent, aimed at balance, aimed at justice, aimed at a better life for everyone. And we'll have to talk later about how that kind of a law can be specified to recognize the conditions of human life and the conditions of history and cultural exposure. Rambam's going to talk about that in part 3 when he talks about the reasons for the laws, and walks you through his thesis that all of the laws of the Mosaic Torah have good reasons. We don't know them all, but he doesn't think that any of them are arbitrary, because that would make God into somebody who's just fooling around. I want to save a minute to address a question that one of you has asked and several of you have probably wondered about, which is about chapter 2. And then after that, we'll have Q&A and discussion and so forth. Something happens in chapter 2 of the guide which takes us beyond the issues of anthropomorphism and gets you into the question of how should we be reading the Torah? In what kind of spirit and with what kind of background and with what kind of intention should we be reading the Torah? And the Rambam tells a story. And the story is that he had a sophisticated acquaintance who was troubled by the story of what our Christian friends and neighbors call the fall. The first thing you need to understand about that biblical story is that although we live in a Christian environment, we Jews do not believe in original sin. We do not believe, for the same reason, in vicarious atonement. We didn't catch our sin by being born in the lineage of Adam. If we sin, that's our own doing, not something that we inherited. And we have to make up for those sins, as we will in the fall, if we haven't done so before, by apologizing to those we've offended or hurt, and making our confession before God. We do that for ourselves. It's not done for us. We don't have vicarious atonement in Judaism. For the same reason, we don't have inherited sin. Both of those concepts are foreign to Judaism, although they're very, very familiar in the Christian context we live in, because vicarious atonement and inherited sin are core ideas of Christianity. That's their way of explaining why Jesus died on the cross, because he died for our sins. Nobody could die for your sins. You've got to take care of your sins yourself. Well, the person that Rambam was dealing with raised a question. And the question was that Adam and Eve disobeyed God. And as a result, they got knowledge of good and evil. And so the questioner, whom Rambam describes as sophisticated, says, wait a minute, that's like one of those myths where somebody, he's thinking of the Titans, not the local team, the Titans of Greek mythology, who did something wrong, rebelled against the gods, and were punished in various ways. And some of the ways was that they were transformed into constellations in the heavens. You think about Orion. Orion is a constellation in the heavens. So what kind of punishment is that? To be made a star in the sky and be there forever? That sounds kind of wonderful. And similarly, isn't it the case that moral knowledge is a really the highest and most wonderful thing about human beings? And how come Adam and Eve are punished by being given moral knowledge, which is the greatest human distinction? And the Rambam's answer to that question begins with a kind of impatience. He says, this is a book that's meant to be a guide to every generation, from the first to the last. It's not something that you can pick up and read casually. He doesn't mean his own book, he means the Torah. It's not something that you can read casually between having a drink and making love. It's a kind of indictment of what's sometimes called reading the Bible as literature. Well, having loosed that bit of annoyance, he goes on to explain that we know very well, and we do know from Chazal, but he doesn't just take it on authority. We knew very well that Adam and Eve had the knowledge of the difference between good and evil before they ate the fruit of the tree. How do we know that? Apart from Chazal. Chazal say so. How do we know it apart from Chazal? Well, because God gave them commands. He said you can eat this and you can't eat that. God doesn't do that to the other animals. You don't give commands to somebody who's incapable of appreciating the importance of obedience and disobedience. You don't give commands to somebody who's not a moral agent. So the objection, which was superficial, was based on a superficial understanding of the Torah. The person was looking to make a captious objection to something and not being patient enough to think it through and say, wait a minute, if God commanded them, they already had the capability of obeying or disobeying. They already had freedom, they already had reason, they were already moral beings. What was it then that was symbolized by the story of eating the fruit? You gotta scratch your head and think about that one. Remember that for the Rambam, the story of Adam and Eve is not the story of an event that occurred. It's a symbolic representation of the nature of humanity. And it's dramatized, which is another kind of poetry, in the Torah, so that they are tempted by the serpent, and they fall for the temptation. And the serpent tells them that if they eat this fruit, you will become like gods. The Rambam's a little antsy about that. He thinks maybe the word Elohim there as it often does, could mean that you will become like superior beings, or you will become like nobility or something like that. I would translate it in 20th century terms. The serpent, after all, speaks with forked tongue. And the essence of all logical fallacies, as Galen taught in his book on fallacies, the essence of all fallacies is that they depend on equivocation. Equivocation means using the same word in different senses. He tells them that they will be like gods, but what he's promising them is not eternal life. He's promising them that they will be moral arbiters. They fell for the illusion that they would become arbiters of right and wrong. That's an illusion which is still very much around today. When I was in college, existentialism was the big fashionable philosophical move. Existentialists believe that what's right is right because we chose it, and if we chose something else, that would have been what's right. That was what they fell for. They thought they would be moral arbiters. How does Rambam argue that point from the text? He notices that Adam and Eve find that the fruit look good, taste good, seem to be good for you. They were using their senses. And then he notices something else, because he does read carefully. He notices that when God supposedly, anthropomorphically, goes looking for Adam and can't find him, supposedly, Adam says, well, I was embarrassed because I was naked. Now, the Torah has told you that Adam and Eve were not embarrassed about being naked in the first place. They became embarrassed by being naked after they ate the fruit. Why? Well, being embarrassed about being naked is a matter of convention. They had fallen into a realm where appetites and passions and conventions were guiding the moral knowledge that they otherwise would have and subverting that knowledge. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with being naked. Now, Rambam doesn't think that people should go around and be nudists, but it's a convention that we wear clothes. And I can tell you, my colleague in Hawaii who went to the Philippines, and he and his wife did field work among the Agta in the Philippines. The Agta people, the women were topless, but they were very shocked that the wife of the anthropologist, who was herself an anthropologist, had her legs exposed. She was wearing shorts in the bush, right? That bothered them. Nakedness is a matter of convention, and that's what the Rambam says. Being subject to appetites and passions and conventions is what human beings are substituting for the moral insight that they have. If there's a difference in the human condition before and after eating the fruit, the difference amounts to thinking that you're an arbiter, thinking that your senses are telling you what's right and wrong, thinking that your appetites are telling you what's right and wrong, thinking that conventions are telling you what's right and wrong, instead of relying on what's actually right and wrong, which you have the moral sense to understand, but the overlay of appetite and passion and convention confuse you. That's a brilliant gloss. Shelley has not been well. He's going to have to go. No? Okay. Well, that's a brilliant gloss of that passage, and it arises from not reading the Torah in a casual way, not reading it as just a bunch of interesting stories, not projecting onto it familiar accounts of those stories which get in the way of making you see what the Torah is really getting at. That's a fascinating piece of exegesis biblical interpretation on the Rambam's part. It's a good example, and he puts it right near the beginning, right after the chapter about Tselem and Demut, image and likeness, because he wants you to know that you shouldn't be reading the Torah in a captious way, looking for little difficulties. I sometimes object, Roberta will tell you, I sometimes object when kids give a bar bat mitzvah speech, that they've been encouraged by someone to show how clever they are by picking a point to make an issue about in the Torah instead of learning from the Torah. The Rambam says the Torah was given as a guide to every generation from the first to the last. Don't read it like a story. Read it to see what you can learn from it. I think I should stop there and we can have Q&A and discussion. Thank you very much for listening so patiently. And I have brought, these are handouts about dates and times which we can pick up later after that.
I need to swear.
You got to go?
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you ever so much.
Okay. Please.
So the Rambam you mentioned starts out with this contradiction between the God that we have come to understand is fully transcendent and all the anthropomorphic language used in the Bible.
Yes.
And I think he, even in the first few chapters, dispatches really well with the idea of God having feet or a hand, because then he would have limitations which would contradict our understanding of transcendent being.
Yeah, and God being non-biological doesn't need feet and hands,
Yeah.
right? He doesn't need to feed himself or walk around.
So there, it's very, I think, easy to see what that's poetry being used, and it's like you said, it's meant to lend to an arrow pointing us in the direction of some other idea, a spiritual high-level idea.
That's right.
The question I have is around divine pathos. If you read the
Yes.
Bible,
Yes.
you come out with an obvious, or at least a very apparent idea that God has emotional states.
Yes.
He's angry and he loves.
Yes.
And if you remove those states, if you try to say, well, those are just trying to point you in a higher direction, it does start to feel to me like an onion. And you start to pull back on mercy. It's hard to use poetic language and say, well, he has zero attributes. He doesn't really have mercy. You just got to peel back, and that's pointing you to a higher level.
Yes.
I'm just not sure how the Rambam does.
That's a great
pathos.
great point to raise. I think the way to start beyond the physical anthropomorphisms, anthropopathy, projecting human emotions, human attitudes onto God, that's a legitimate point for you to raise. The basic way that I would address that would be in terms of the idea of chen v'chesed. Those are, of course, anthropomorphic terms. All the terms are going to be anthropomorphic. They have to be because Dibrat Torah Lashon Ben Adam, the Torah speaks in human language. But he's okay with the idea that God is generous. He's okay with the idea that God is. He doesn't like the idea of mercy because it sounds like it means affectedness. And God is not going to be affected. God is totally transcendent. But God is also very generous. And that's one of the things, if we read on and read about the epiphany to Moses, when Moses asks on Mount Sinai, he says to God, this is after the golden calf incident, Moses says to God, show me your ways. And the Rambam notices that Moses makes that request after he has found the people are very fractious, they're ex-slaves, they're very difficult to deal with and to manage, and he's going to have to lead them. And so he wants to know God's ways. And he really means God's ways of governance, because he himself is going to be charged with governing his people. And he knows, as we know, the Jews aren't that easy to govern. So God says, you can't see my face and live, but I will show you my back. I'll cover you up, and Rambam interprets it to mean I'll skip the face, and I'll show you my back. how does he interpret it when he says, I mean, we know that God doesn't have a back any more than he has a front. God is not a physical being. So what's he talking about? Rambam says that what was revealed to Moses was the panoply of nature, because that's what follows from or flows from God. Metaphorically, notice the word back is plural in the Hebrew, so everything that comes after God, what would that be? He says that's the panoply of nature, my translation. Why? Because if you understand nature, you'll understand how God governs. And that's what Moses needs to know if he's to model himself upon divine governance. And how does God govern? That's actually revealed in those attributes which we recite, as I mentioned, on Yom Kippur. Erech Apayim Rav Chesed Ve'emet, that God is full of patience, chesed, grace, generosity, those attributes, and of course, tzedek, truth, justice. God governs in the way he rules nature. If you study nature, and Rambam believes that if you're a scientist and you study nature, you'll see the ingenuity of divine creation. You'll see the brilliance, not only the intricacy, but the intimacy. You'll see the kindness and generosity of God. Now, those terms are human terms. You'll see characteristics in nature which would lead you to say, if this had been designed by a human being, the human being must have been very considerate, very caring, made the living beings so that they were capable of surviving. There was food for them. There was an echo niche. All the things that we discover in science. Rambam believes that the study of science will teach you more about God, because it'll be like reading a book and understanding about the author from reading the book. If you study nature, you will understand how God governs.
But are you understanding attributes of God?
Yes, you're really understanding, but you're understanding attributes of God in human terms. This is what we would say of a human being. If a human being had designed a mechanism like this, he must have been a very clever, very caring human being. Now that's analogical. It doesn't pin God down, but it again shows you the right direction, and the direction would be love, caring, grace. Erech Apayim B'Rav Chesed Ve'emet.
I don't want to fill.
Please, no, that's good.
Every time we get to that point, it's like, okay, it's pointing us to what direction? It's pointing us in the direction that God actually does love and care, or that we use the English language, the anthropomorphize the language of God loves and cares, but it's pointing us to something higher. And then where does it go? And I know it's somewhat ineffable. I'm trying to get to like.
No, I think you're right. No, I think he thinks that. I'll go one step further, and that'll bring it back. He doesn't think that God has attributes. What then will you say about divine justice? He says that justice is inseparable from God. It's what God is. Then you're knowing God as he really is. Justice means balance, he says, using the Arabic, because the Arabic word for justice is adl, which means balance. Justice is balance. What's it balance between? It's balance between chen, chesed, grace, generosity, and tzedek, which is drawing a line and saying, okay, the water can't invade the earth, the sky and the earth have to be separate. Those are. He doesn't want to say their characteristics, because that would limit God, but he thinks that God is his own justice. That is essential. That is. When we use a word like justice, it's normally for us it's metaphorical, because we'll say, well, justice is what a king does if he's a good king, or something like that. The best interpretation of that I know in the Talmud, in this thing we read every Pesach, that God didn't execute judgment upon the Egyptians by way of a seraph or an angel, etc., or cherub or whatever. God did it himself. He thinks that God's actions are not done by way of faculties, because God didn't have faculties. They're not expressions of attributes, because God didn't have attributes. They are expressions of God himself. If you want to understand it, I'm glad you brought this up, because if you want to understand God in a higher way, you will understand that God is God's justice, God is God's wisdom, God is God's power. And if we try to understand that in human terms, we're going to make the analogy, that the world is a brilliant system, and designed to last. I'll add one more thing. Again, it comes from Plato. Rambam does not believe in the Christian and Muslim idea that there will be this great cataclysm and the moon will turn red with blood and the whole world will fall apart and everything like that. He thinks that what is created, and he does believe the world is created, cannot by its own essence last forever. But he thinks that God, in God's grace, will let it last forever. He draws that from Plato's Timaeus, another dialogue that was very important to people who read it in Arabic, because it's a dialogue that has a creation story in it, dialogue of Plato. But he uses an Aristotelian idea to explain how God keeps the world going, even though by its own nature it can't last forever, being a physical thing. How does God keep it going? Well, the Aristotelian idea is that nature recycles. All the elements turn into one another, everything comes from something else and goes back to something else, and that stability of the divine system, in Aristotelian terms, that's what keeps the world going. So if you want to believe that God in his love sustains the world, you can ask the Aristotelian question, how? And the Aristotelian answer is because it's a self-sustaining system, because the destruction of one thing is the buildup of another. And that is how he glosses the famous midrashic remark that one of the rabbis said in the Talmud, when it says, when the world is finished, God saw, and not just that it was good, but that it was very good. Tov meod, right? Why, when it was finished, was it better than when each of the individual parts was created? This rabbi punned on Tov meod, and he said, Tov mavet. Death is good. Even death is good. Why? Because the buildup of one thing is the breakdown of another, the breakdown of one thing is the buildup of another, and that's how God's grace is manifested in the sustaining of the world. It doesn't logically have to exist, but God wouldn't let it fall apart. And that's how God sustains it. So it's he takes what sounds like a very paradoxical rabbinic statement, and he interprets it in terms of what he learns from Aristotle about how what Plato had called divine grace is manifested in the sustenance of the world. But your basic point is very good. Here's where you have to make a distinction. There are emotions which are passive, and God doesn't have passive emotions because he can't be affected. But God has active emotions. And active emotions include chen v'chesed. Right. Yeah. Lovely question. Thanks for bringing it up. Linda.
Well,
Matt's next.
oh, okay. I have sort of two quick questions, because I'm not a philosopher, and I've enjoyed this so much. First of all, on God and giving God anthropomorphic characteristics. And my simple way of looking at it, and you can tell me, in doing that, you touched on that a few minutes ago, that it really limits the qualities, as opposed to looking at God not anthropomorphically, but infinitely.
Yes.
So,
That's not a question, that's an answer.
okay. So, well, and I think, I want to make sure I think that's what you're saying, but let me ask you.
But we have to know what infinite would mean. Mm-hmm. There's infinitely small and infinitely large and infinitely big, and then, when I say that the subtext in the lexicon is to direct you, is to point the way in which that infinity should be pursued, that this involves perfection, that perfection is what's less physical and more spiritual. That's orienting you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which has really been wonderful hearing that. Let me ask you, something that's always really bothered me is when people of all kinds try to tell us what God thinks. God says this, God says that. How does Rambam and you, how do you approach that?
If he finds things in the Torah, he's going to try and make sense of them, because he thinks, he believes that the Torah is divine revelation. Bringing it down to the level of our desires might not be the wisest way to read the Torah. So people who think that they can speak for God are taking a big risk. And there were people like that in his time, as there are today. And some of them will stand on a street corner and, the world is about to end and so forth. And that's an expression of their own psychology and their own situation. There's a place in the Torah where Moses first encounters God at the burning bush, and he says he wants to know God's name. He says, the Israelites will ask me, who is it that you say sent you? And God says his name is Ehyeh. And then he spells it out, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And he abbreviates it in the form of what we call the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, Yud Kei Vav Kei. We say K instead of A, but we don't pronounce that word. He believes that God has represented his absoluteness to Moses. He believes that absoluteness expressed in the first person, I am, amounts to a kind of proof. I believe that it amounts to something similar to what philosophers have called the ontological argument, that God has the kind of being that can't fail to exist. That's absolute being. Now that's one place in the Torah where God speaks in the first person and speaks to the question of what are you? The Israelites are going to ask, and Rambam says they're right to ask. If somebody claims to speak in God's name, you better make sure that he knows what he's talking about. You got to be critical. And he praises the Israelites because Moses anticipates that they will ask that question. How do you prove that there would be a God? God gives him the argument that he is absolute. And he leaves it to us to figure out better what that could possibly mean. I think that somebody of the sort that you described, who goes along operating under the assumption that he could tell you what God wants and what God thinks, and etc., etc., such a person might well have an inflated idea about his own awareness. And it's better in a way to be more modest. One of the things that Rambam says, Moses is known as a very humble man. He's supposed to be, the Torah says, he was the humblest of all people. Part of his humility is that he didn't rush to grasp it all. He doesn't think that he's going to comprehend it all. He's going to approach it slowly. He's going to ask questions. He's going to feel his way, and he's going to let God do the talking. That's something that some of those people, I get the impression from the tone that you're ascribing to the people who raise that kind of point, that they think they know. And a lot of times, people who think they know don't know as much as they think they know. Let me take Matt over there. Matt had a point.
Thanks. You mentioned something coming out of nothing earlier.
I did.
So that's a big question to me. And so how do you talk about that in terms of when this was written so many years ago? Because they're competing narratives today for can something come out of nothing, and obviously some try and explain that.
I'm gonna save that one for next time, but I will tell you one word that will help, because I have argued in the Guide to the Guide in particular that all of the problems of Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah that Rambam is going to address have a family resemblance. The family resemblance is that they involve the discontinuity, the disproportion, the disproportionality between the infinite perfection of God and the determinate limitations of the world we live in. But all of those questions have not only a family resemblance in terms of the source of the difficulty, but they also have a family resemblance in terms of the idea that the Rambam uses to try and answer the question. And the one word I want you to remember, and you can read more about it in the Guide to the Guide especially, the one word to remember is emanation. Emanation is a Neoplatonic idea. Neoplatonism was a system of philosophy that combined Aristotle with Plato, was dominant from the 3rd century when Plotinus introduced it, down to modern times, and is still prominent in English literature and poetry and so forth. Emanation is a way of making Platonism dynamic rather than static, and it's based on the idea that the source of all things and the ultimate reality of causality is intellectual. Okay? Think about emanation, and that will help you to see a way to address your question about where does the world come from, how could there be something when there was nothing there before, but also the question of how could the absolute perfection of God inspire the mind of a prophet, how could the absolute perfection of God limit itself to the particular requirements of a given system of law and ethics. All of those questions will be addressed by the Rambam in terms of emanation. I'll give you an image of emanation, and that will be enough for today. The image comes from Plotinus. The image is lighting a candle. When I light a candle from a match or from another candle, the image is that the flame is transferred but not diminished. Now we know in physics there is a little diminution going on anyway, but the real image of emanation, since emanation is intellectual, is teaching. The nature of teaching is such that when I impart an idea, something that I learned from the Rambam, and you now heard or thought about or read about here or in your reading, I haven't lost anything by sharing what I know. Rambam hasn't lost anything by sharing what he saw. Emanation does not reduce, the physical image about emanation in terms of a candle. Of course there is a transfer of energy. But take it out of the physical realm and into the intellectual realm, where emanation really applies. I don't lose what I know because I share it with all those who have come. Let's stop there, and we'll meet again next time, and Send an email or something if you need more books. I can bring more, but and if you haven't got your book signed yet, I can do that. And I'm going to have breakfast now.
Thank you.